35. Fat. Liquid gold. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be exploring the role of fat in 17th century American food. Compared to our modern lives, there was a lot less fat available for each person, but fat played a prominent role in food and was often on the minds of the 17th century colonists. And some of the ways we think about fat now has been influenced by those 17th century thoughts. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know about 17th century fat is that almost all of the fat eaten by colonists was animal fat. By the 18th century, there will be a pretty good amount of nut and seed oils, but those require presses and other machines. Human, animal, wind, and water powered, I might add. And as I hope I have made clear, in the early years of future America, people were having trouble with things like roofs and bread, so cold-pressed walnut oil was a bit further down the list at this point. So how did 17th century Europeans get their fat? And I am very particularly calling out Europeans, Western Europeans even, since plant fats were accessed by much of the world at this point, in great variety and abundance. Notably, coconut, tree nut, palm, along with a wide variety of seed oils were used in Africa and South and East Asia, alongside animal fats. But Western Europe, for a combination of reasons, climate and technological mainly, but cultural chauvinism as well, limited what fats the majority of Europeans and European colonists in North America had access to. Compared to our modern access to fat, the 17th century colonists, even in relatively comfortable New Amsterdam, had a very sparse selection of fats separated from their whole source. So not only were there fewer fats to choose from, just go look at the oil aisle at any grocery store. And if you check out the oil aisles in stores serving South Asian, East Asian, Hispanic, or African cooks, the variety will approach overwhelming. The total amount of accessible fat was just less. Reasons for this include the fact that some of our most common modern vegetable fats are produced using energy-greedy, high heat and high pressure mechanical processes, simply unavailable to your 17th century food producer. But the rest of the difference is due to there being simply less fat per animal. Building up and carrying around large fat reserves in our domestic birds, pigs, cows, and sheep has been created in modern times through a combination of breeding, feeding domestic animals a richer diet, and limiting their movement. The terrifying piggies in need of laws and a hog reeve in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were not building up the inches-thick lard layer that would later fill the funnel cake frying vats of future fairgrounds. The early 17th century pigs were foraging for food in the streets and surrounding woods, so not as well fed as the modern domestic hog. And they were strolling about town and country all day, thus keeping rather svelte and possibly swole as hog physique goes. And I've gone on about the unpampered lifestyles of the other farmyard inhabitants as well, which should explain why the, quote, fatted calf was a big deal. Someone had to put in a lot of extra work to get noticeable fat on a meat animal, thus rendering it a very special feast food. Starting in the 18th century, the stall ox will emerge as the first sort of feedlot animals in America. Those first colonists were aware that fat doesn't just happen when it comes to your farm animals. It's something that requires effort and planning. Anyway, the picture is clear. The animals that were the source of animal fats were generally stringier than their modern counterparts. That being said, there was fat to be had, and this is more or less how it broke down. A lot of the fat eaten in the 17th century was simply consumed in whole food form, simply as part of the plant or animal where it was produced. Besides the fat to be found on farm animals, hunting and fishing was the other major source of 17th century fat. There were fatty fish like eel, and the returning anadromous fish, salmon, shad, and smelt as they returned to freshwater to spawn. Fish and shellfish roe or eggs were also widely sought after fatty treats. fall bear, all fattened up for a long hibernation, or winter ducks, once they had gotten down to feeding in the Carolinas for the winter, were known as good sources of fat. This is why there are hunting seasons, by the way. If someone was going to go to the effort of killing an animal for food, the animal should have their highest stores of fat and be likely to be their healthiest, be less diseased, and be less subject to parasites. Granted, fur trappers had different goals, which is why they were out trapping in the winter snows. At the end of the century, I may look into some of the mindset that existed with some of the more adventuring colonists that did in local meat animal populations and seriously endangered local food supplies for sloppily invading colonists and original local inhabitants alike. But I'm here to talk about the food right now. So what were the fats to be found sitting in pots and crocks on the shelf to be accessed and added to recipes? The common selection in approximate order of fanciness was olive oil, butter, suet or tallow, lard, goose grease or duck fat, schmaltz or chicken fat, drippings, and slush. Olive oil, then, was seriously rich people oil, and due to the months and months and possibly years it traveled from the olive oil source, it never was the floral, olivey, flavorful stuff that the stereotypical TV chef rhapsodizes about now. Rather, it would be neutral in flavor or a bit rancid, but it still had properties different from all the animal fats and was used to dress the salads on the tables of the royal, the noble, and the wealthy, as the fancy vegetables of the French and Dutch were starting to spread throughout Europe. Their Dutch, with their madness for coleslaw, might show off with an olive oil dressing, but bacon fat was just as likely. And since it was a rare English person who had ever seen an olive, much less had any idea how olive oil even happened, it was often simply called salad oil. The name simply tied this ludicrously expensive oil with this raw vegetable madness that was being taken up by the wild youth, along with their coffee, tea, chocolate, and tobacco. Plants really were causing havoc and social destabilization in 17th century Europe. So as you can see, the American suspicion of and lack of regard for vegetable foods has a long and venerable history. Now, butter. Butter was butter. We've talked about it a fair bit by now. The essential thing to remember was that most butter was cultured, not sweet. And because there were fewer cows than now, each giving far less milk per cow, there was simply less butter. It was often a seasonal food, as cows only gave milk with enough fat to bother with butter making during a limited part of their milking cycle. Very large estates with large dairies and extensive servant or enslaved staffs might show off with butter year-round, but again, this was incredibly rare to never in the 17th century colonies. Due to the limited cows early on, butter was a food only some people had. But as cows increased, access to butter also steadily increased during the century. But on the relative wealth scale, at this point you had to be pretty well off to make your own butter, or buy or trade for it from your neighbors. Bottom line, not only were there no rolls at the first Thanksgiving, there was no butter to put on them. Suet is the hard, white, and fairly uninterrupted fat that sits on the kidneys of cows and sheep. Well, the fat's there in all mammals, but the scale in these farm animals is what gets all the attention. It works as insulation and protection for these hard-working organs, so even the stringy 17th century versions had a noticeable supply. This would be tried out or rendered, that is, the fat bits melted out of the gristle and membranes and whatnot. The rendering process also removed most of the rest of the water and other bits inside that could rot. The result was a very smooth, white, and very resistant to going rotten or rancid fat. The resulting product was often called tallow. Suet was used in crusts for very nice pies and used as a cover for other foods. Because it is hard at nearly any room temperature a 17th century colonial person was likely to experience, discs of it would be used as stoppers for the potted meats and jarred, long-keeping pickles I've mentioned. Potted meats and farces would also have suet added to help them keep longer. The rendered tallow would also be used in the same way, and it was hard enough to be made into candles. Certainly second best to beeswax, of course, but acceptably fancy all the same. When a fat that was solid at room temperature was needed, suet was the winner, and a very frequently desired fat. Next down in the rankings was lard. At this point, because the pigs were comparatively stringy and generally scary, lard ranks lower in the fats people have around as a separate thing. Most pig fat at this point is simply consumed with the rest of the pig, or as drippings. Tried out lard, to be used alone in cooking and baking, will emerge as a front runner, especially in the Southeast soon. But in the 17th century, it isn't being collected in large, deep, fat-frying quantities. Lard mainly stood in as a baking fat where and when there wasn't butter. Lard could also show up in potted meats and farces when the fancier suet wasn't about. Also, lardons, slivers and slices of lard, were stuffed in and around the stringy birds of the time. But this was a fancy table feature where a household had a cook and a kitchen staff to do things like wrap birds and fatty bacon. The purest expression of lard came at hog killing time, when cracklings or gratons were made. Pig skin with the bristles removed, of course, and with some or all of the fat attached, would be cooked down. This would drive all the moisture out, again making a fat that would resist going rancid. But all the skin would end up cooked crisp and crackling. By the time you hear this, I will have just been at the boucherie I get to be a part of down in Georgia, and will have gotten my hands on some fresh cracklings. As Cookie Monster would say, for this modern human, that's a sometimes food. Though if you had been in the world where humans were chopping all the wood to render the lard, along with so much else, I suppose you would be entitled to a good helping. Okay, as I wrote all that, keep that whole sentiment and set of, quote, reasoning in mind when I get to next week at the end of this list of fat prestige rankings, and I'll be talking about fat, virtue, and morality. Anyway, back to fat rankings. Goose grease and duck fat are very common practical fats that have largely fallen out of general usage. Geese and ducks, as waterfowl, have extra insulation and floatiness granted to them by a higher fat content in their skin. Every quasi-professional cooking show worth its salt will at some point do the duck breast cooking thing, and the whole trick is getting the skin to render properly while also cooking the meat to whatever temperature is correct for that time and place. But the whole thing is ducks and geese have quite a bit of fat on them. It can be rendered out. There's a big clump in their tails too, same as with chickens, which is generally known as the Pope's nose for irreverent reasons. Rendering out the fat from a goose or duck is much less of a big deal than with larger animals. And as rendered fat, it was proof against rancidity for a reasonable period of time. These would be common kitchen fats to have around when new fat was needed, and was often used in first aid as salves and rubs for bumps and bruises and sprains and burns and boils and abscesses and all the minor problems of the 17th century semi-outdoor life. All waterfowl fats would often be lumped together as goose grease, since, like hippopotamus, why mess with fun words? Unlike olive oil, butter, suet, or lard, which each take money and or a fair amount of communal or family work to produce and access, goose grease was fairly accessible to nearly all. Chicken fat was less fancy still. I included the anachronistic word schmaltz, since this was how many people knew about chicken fat in 20th century America. And the connotations of the word of something being schmaltzy usually meant it was invoking common, cheap sentiment. And as these fats go, relative to the fats so far, chicken fat was common and unspecial. I say chicken fat here, but it really could be the fat from any boiled bird. While goose grease would be rendered, fatty portions heated alone to separate out the fat, bird fat from boiled birds is different in purity. Modern cooks make schmaltzy chicken fat all the time. Anytime we make chicken broth from chicken scraps, when the broth is cooled and you get that layer of solid fat that forms on the top of the broth, that's the schmaltz. This is great, tasty cooking fat. Using it in your European dumplings to add to soup, cooking vegetables in this, or using it to finish cooked grains is smashing. But by pulling it out of a broth, it will have much of the flavor of the chicken and anything else that was cooking with the bird, the onions or the vegetables or whatever. This is no longer a new fat. It will contain all the flavors it picked up while boiling with the bird in the stew kettle. For most ways I would use schmaltz, having extra flavors is actually a plus. But on the fanciness scale, it is lower down since it is less pure. And again, pretty much anyone could make some if they have just a few chickens or bag a couple of birds. And all it takes is that kettle. No other pots were needed at all. Now after chicken fat, we start to get to the really low-class fats. While chicken fat or bird broth fat was kind of a byproduct, it was still its own thing. But drippings, on the other hand, these were completely a byproduct, to the point where they were often seen as valueless enough to be regularly given to the poor and or the help. Drippings are just what they say. When a joint or haunch or roast or other hunk of meat is roasted over a fire, liquids are going to drip from the meat as the cells are cooked in the heat. The expelled liquid is largely a sort of mineral water containing salts from the cells along with proteins, carbohydrate fragments, and fat that melts out from in and around the muscles that are roasting above or next to the fire. This combined liquid contains fat, but is not pure at all, and has often been a bit carbonized due to being extracted over a fire. No denying that this is darn tasty, especially when employed in making sauces and using it to flavor the accompaniments to go with the roast. But compared with a roast beast that produced the drippings, they lack a certain heft and relatively are seriously lacking in nourishment. There is nothing new fat about drippings. They were scraped up after the roasting. And in the age of few pans, lots of drippings just went into the fire. In fact, contemporary smoked eel recipes expected fat to drip from cooking eels and then smoking the eels to make for longer keeping. And yes, it also made them smoky delicious. But collecting drippings from roasted meats would produce this mixture of somewhat carbonized but admittedly pretty tasty gunk. The clearest drippings were used as sauces, basically a jus. The rest would be poured over bread or corn or other grain meshes. While such a combination served as breakfast for many, this was often the meal given to children when there was only enough meat for the adults, or to the women and children when there was only enough meat for the men. Drippings in bread or mush was a common dinner for servants and the enslaved alike. As a kitchen fat, it was rarely saved for later use the way everything else I have mentioned might be. At the cool to cold house and pantry temperatures of the day, drippings would last for a few days if it wasn't all eaten up immediately. But because it was such a mixture of so many things, it was in no way a long-keeping source of fat. And as anyone with a spit and a fire, indoors or out, and any type of meat, flesh, fish, or fowl could produce drippings, it had no special standing. But at the bottom of the fat rankings, we come to slush. I think I ran across this first in either reading up on the delicious food of the high seas under the British Admiralty or in researching soap making back in my chemistry teacher days. Regardless, if your food was being made with slush, you were far from the centers of fanciness. What, I'm sure you're asking at this point, is slush? Well, in the 17th century, it was fairly common to have a kettle of brothy type stuff in the back of the fire that all manner of scraps might be tossed into to create something that would be available to add to whatever was needed. feed the staff in a pinch, offer a visitor a warming drink, and just have a pot ready for cooking up peas or barley or whatever. For a familiar reference, that bowl of brown that Arya Stark encounters in the bad part of King's Landing when she's sorting out her new version of her life, that would have been that kind of thing. As would be the cooking kettle on board a ship, where fresh water was too precious to be wasted by throwing out uneaten stew, or even washing out the pot. The rinse water would just be the base of the next round of stew. So in the end, these continuous stew pots were emptied and cleaned somewhere between rarely and never. The bones of various bird wings, rabbit carcasses, and possibly a few bones from larger animals might also be fished out as the meat came away. Now the pot might not be emptied, but it would cool down. And when that happened, the assorted fats from the assorted animals would congeal. Whether this slush is the source for the snow slush word or vice versa, I have no idea. But if you picture one, you have a decent idea of what the other one looks like. The fact that this congealed fat from the back of the fire stew pot was considered a food item and not trash should help bring home just how common not enough food was for most of the colonials. Slush was a common thing to add to stews that leaned heavily into things like peas, whole or cracked grains, and maybe some stringy meat, dried or salted or whatever. The calories and the satisfying feeling of eating fat were, again, essential to these people for whom everything was accomplished using just muscles and a few simple machines. They saw starvation and experienced hunger on a fairly regular basis. As a result, while slush was not fancy at all, it was fat. And unless you were an extremely fancy person, slush, this sort of accumulation of fats from multiple sources, was incorporated into some of your meals. And if somehow you were a very fancy person and you never ate it yourself, it was definitely used to feed your people. Now, it wasn't all eating this mystery fat. Slush would also be collected and used to make soap. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm about to go way off track. So, I've realized a bonus episode on soap is going to happen. I've been sneaking up on it, apparently. So I'll explain no more here about the soap making process, but look for that bonus in the feed later. So, plenty of people did eat slush, and as I hope I've made clear, it was the least fancy of all. So that's the rankings of the prestige of fats in the 17th century British colonies. But that's only the first part of what I set out here to do. I also wanted to spend some time looking at the two-sided relationship many of the early colonists had with fat. To the soldiers, adventurers, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans and Native Americans within the colonial sphere, there wasn't really a moral element to fat, except possibly as a marker of a person as generous when their access to the life-giving stuff was not cut off. But for the more religiously devout colonists, fat had a distinctly moral element to it, above and beyond the pure nourishment it provided. And that is what I'm going to dive into next week. For some reason, I thought I could cover everything in one episode, but come on, look at America now. The space that conversations and opinions about fat and the morality of food take up on any given day is actually kind of incredible. I was foolish to think I was going to sum up the beginnings of that in just one go. So join me next week as I dive into the moral implications of fat in the 17th century colonies and how some of the groundwork for our modern issues with food, fat, and even body shapes were laid down all the way back then. Oh, and we'll get pictures up of the cracklings I got to eat at the boucherie, including the hog's tail and several of the other goodies. Unlike on my Twitter, where I was including some of the more visceral pictures of the boucherie, they were clearly labeled so you could choose what you wanted to see. All of this will be cooked food pictures. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. I know you're out there listening. Just drop a few words, a rating, whatever, wherever you prefer to listen, and help me make sure I'm headed in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.